You see, none of it was real. It was illusion. Your art, your science, it was all a nightmare. Now it's done. Finished.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid.
There is no going back. Our enemy pushes us on and on and on. And until we're strong enough or can find Earth and get help, we can never stop or turn
People
away
should not be
or look
afraid
back.
of their governments.
It's got to find the moral high ground when we're all standing in the mud.
I am not a number. I am a free man.
Choice is an illusion created between those with power and those who haven't.
Happy heresies, and welcome to the desert of the real. This is Aeon Gnostic Radio, an initiation by conversation into the dark corners of myth, magic, and meaning. A crash course in cult, culture, and conspiracy. A virtuous virus invoking and informing history, holiness, and heresy. Each week, I, your host, Miguel Connor, commandeers your connection to bring the most accepted and rejected scholars and provocateurs to your attention. Fun, compelling, and deeply weird, this is the blow-your-mind cocktail party conversation you always wanted to listen in on. And you deserve to be here, for you are a shining crazy diamond that should be seen and can ignite the universe with so much wonder.
It's better to burn out than to fade away.
This is the greatest adventure you've been waiting for in all your lifetimes. Finding out who you really are and what reality is not. As Mark Twain allegedly said, the two most important days in your life are the day you were born and the day you find out why.
There are no coincidences, Delia. Only the illusion of coincidence.
This is a special episode and something to commemorate the holiday season. Whether you're drawing from the solstice magic or battling mephitic materialism. Either way, you're going to find some trenchant gnosis to brighten your divine spark.
Oh boy, I've never gotten a package this big. I've always wanted to have a huge package.
As I've mentioned before, many of you have asked for thematic shows, as we did back in October on Mary Magdalene. This one will deal with Hermes Trismegistus, one of the founders of Gnosticism, and Hermeticism in general. I think you'll love the content, but let me know as always. Say either, yay Miguel, or go fornicate yourself, Miguel, and the Gorgon you rode in on.
You know what I'm going to get you next Christmas? A big wooden cross. So every time you feel unappreciated for all your sacrifices, you can climb on up and nail yourself to it.
We'll start with an old intro on the Doctrines of Hermes from yours truly. Then we'll have Jesse, or Brother Spark, founder of the Old Palm Tree Garden, discussing the history of Hermeticism. That will be followed by our seminal interview with the amazing Gary Lachman from his book, The Quest for the Historical Hermes, on the philosophical and mystic aspects of Hermeticism. We end with Aaron Leitch, one of today's prominent magicians, on the magical, astrological, and occult aspects of Hermeticism, including some very cool exercises like astral travel.
Welcome to the Revelation Superhighway.
Almost 3 hours that covers the alpha and omega of Hermes and Hermeticism. Even if you've heard one or two of these, together you'll be much more enlightened. AB Prime members and patrons at Patreon get the full dope, while everyone else will get Brother Spark's full interview and half of Gary's. So yes, please support if you find value in this content. Aeon Gnostic Radio provides guests and topics you won't find anywhere else. This is the one and only resource for that Gnostic wisdom that is more important than ever in these darkening times.
America doesn't bail out the losers. America was built by bailing out winners, by rigging a nation of the winners, for the winners, by the winners. Only 1 in 100 is going to get on that ark, son. And every other poor soul's going to drown. I'm not going to drown.
I am 100% audience supported, and I can always use your help. What's more, I've got some incredible projects coming in December that includes my first one-to-one video interview and some surprises that will blow your spiritual uterus away. Not to mention incredible guests and topics that are as illuminating as they are controversial. In fact, our next show will have Nicholas Laus giving us part 2 of The Meaning of Being Illuminati, out in a few days. So please help out with subscriptions, shekels, equipment, volunteering, or whatever you can think of. I can't do it without you, and I truly appreciate those of you who are there for me. Heck and heckity, those of you who send me film audio clips really help, and thank you for all who do. Again, if you find value in this content, help grow this Red Pill cafeteria. If you're already an AB Prime member or patron at Patreon, share and promote this blasphemy whenever you can. And thanks to Vance, Deej Atwood, Luthien, Joanna, Nate, Scott Smith, Peeps at the Inner Sanctum, and others who make the core Sangha of Aeon Gnostic Radio here at the Virtual Alexandria. But enough of my drivel. Let us do a special show on Hermes Trismegistus and Hermeticism. You're getting closer to finding out why you were born.
Yet Hermetism, as mentioned before, takes a more optimistic role borrowed from the Greek myth of Narcissus. In its cosmology, the Logos, or the mind of God, or the first thought of God, was enchanted by his reflection down in the realm of the Demiurge, who is not considered negative in the same vein as Plato's Demiurge. The Demiurge simply fashions the universe out of leftover matter from the Pleroma, or the world of ideas.
I am the supreme being. I'm not entirely dim.
Anyway, this loving curiosity leads the Logos down the heavens until he is weighed down by the angels that fall in love with his divine perfection. And thus he is trapped on this world, but in a less deleterious way. All the Logos needs to do is purify himself, turn his lead into gold. Like with Gnosticism, the path of ascent is the same as the path of descent. But the ascent isn't a spiritual fistfight, but a regaining of godly knowledge. This represents the plight of all humans. There is also more alchemy and astrology than with Gnosticism, although less stern philosophy and theology.
I'm prophetic, not infallible.
Hermeticism is centered around the mysterious figure of Hermes Trismegistus, which we will deal with shortly. Let us say that he is a mystifying figure that is the source of all Hermetic ideals. The term as above, so below is accredited to Mr. Hermes. He was accepted in medieval times because many believed that he interacted with Moses himself.
Moses, this is the Lord thy God, commanding you to obey my law. Do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you, I hear you. A deaf man could hear you.
What?
Nothing, forget it.
Later, though, he was repudiated, but the Enlightenment came and it was just too late. Like Jesus, Buddha, and Krishna, he is more than likely a mythological character, a principle of the universe, and an indwelling savior.
Why me? Because you're perfect. You have a point there.
Now I'd like to read about Hermes Trismegistus and his attributed works from David Fiedler's Jesus Christ, Son of God. I think you'll note the similarities between this pagan logos and the Gnostic logos. Here it be.
Were you going to plagiarize the whole thing for us? Do you have any thoughts of your own on this matter? Or is that your thing? You come into a bar, you read some obscure passage, and then pretend you pawn it off as your own idea just to impress some girls? Embarrass my friend?
The name Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, is connected with those valuable writings of Pagan Gnosis known as the Corpus Hermeticum. Like the introduction to the Gospel of John, the Hermetic writings orbit around the Hellenistic idea of the solar logos. Hence, according to one of the Hermetic tractates, the light word which emanated from mind is the Son of God. Having taken over the attributes of the ancient Egyptian divinity Thoth, Hermes Trismegistus was imagined as an ancient sage, the revealer of all arts and sciences, the inventor of the alphabet, mathematics, writing, theology, geometry, and so on.
I know Kung Fu.
The Hermetic writings were naturally attributed to him because, as Lamblicus notes, Hermes the god who presides over language was formerly very properly considered as common to all priests, and the power who presides over the true science concerning the gods is one and the same in the whole of things. Hence our ancestors dedicated the inventions of their wisdom to this deity, inscribing all their own writings with the name of Hermes. The Hermetic sermons, or logio, are written in dialogue from in between Hermes, the informing word, and a student. Trismegistus is in reality the Egyptian personification of the universal order, as Gnostic revealer. As one scholar notes, he was the source of all knowledge, previously known only to the gods. For the Christians, Christ the Logos was the Gnostic revealer, the bestower of liberating knowledge and heavenly wisdom. The quote-unquote word manifests itself as a mediator between the eternal heavenly principles and their temporal earthly reflections. A similar function is performed by the dialogues of Hermes Trismegistus and the teachings and miracles of Christ, both of which reflect a common system of cosmological and geometrical symbolism.
We are dreamers, shapers, singers, and makers. We study the mysteries of laser and circuit, crystal and scanner, holographic demons and invocations of equations. These are the tools we employ, and we know many things.
Hermes Trismegistus is not only connected with the important writings of Corpus Hermeticum, but, as the inventor of all arts and sciences, he is also associated with the ancient art of alchemy. One of the oldest and most profound of all alchemical documents is the so-called Emerald Tablets of Hermes Trismegistus, and this I will read to you right now.
Let's go, on board, let's go.
Number 1. In truth, certainly and without doubt, whatever is below is like that which is above, and whatever is above is like that which is below, to accomplish the miracle of one thing. Number 2. Just as all things proceed from one alone by meditation on one alone, so also they are born from this one thing by adaptation. Number 3. Its father is the sun, S-U-N, and its mother is the moon. The wind has borne it in his body. Its nurse is the earth. Number 4. It is the father of every miraculous work in the whole world. Number 5. Its power is perfect if it is converted into earth. Number 6. Separated the earth from the fire and the subtle from the gross, softly and with great prudence. Number 7. It rises from earth to heaven and comes down again from heaven to earth, and thus acquires the power of the realities above and the realities below. In this way you will acquire the glory of the whole world, and all darkness will leave you. Number 8. This is the power of all powers, for it conquers everything subtle and penetrates everything solid. Number 9. Thus the little world, microcosm, is created according to the prototype of the great world, the macrocosm. Number 10. From this and in this way, marvelous applications are made. Number 11. For this reason I am called Hermes Trismegistus, for I possess the 3 parts of wisdom of the whole world. Number 12. Perfect is what I have said of the work of the sun. And that, my beloved true seekers, is the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. And I would check some of the other writings like the Poimandres, the Shepherd of Men, and other works from Hermes Trismegistus. But enough of my drivel. Let us saunter to the interview with Aaron Leitch.
You seek a great fortune, you three who are now in chains. You will find a fortune, though it will not be the fortune you seek. But first you must travel a long and difficult road, a road fraught with peril. You shall see things wonderful to tell. You shall see a cow on the roof of a cotton house. And oh, so many startlings. I cannot tell you how long this road shall be, but fear not the obstacles in your path. For fate has vouchsafed your reward. Though the road may wide, yea, your hearts grow weary, still shall ye follow the way, even unto your salvation.
Hermeticism is often called the nicer pagan cousin of Christian Gnosticism. Is that a fair statement? And if true, they are dear to your heart, as you've mentioned before, right?
Yeah, they definitely are. If you don't mind, I'd like to start with a little bibliography, if that's okay.
Please go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to recommend a few books, pretty standard spiel. If you're going to study Hermeticism, a primer to the thought of the ancient Hermetic is Garth Fowden's The Egyptian Hermes. I also have a copy of Walter Scott's Corpus Hermeticum. I would have preferred the Knock edition, but all the translations are in French, and it's kind of a hard book to get a hold of. Walter Scott's is real easy to get a hold of. You can get hold of it online on Amazon. It's got the Greek and an English translation. I also recommend Bentley Leighton's Gnostic Scriptures, which is a fantastic book for understanding Gnosticism for Gnosticism's sake. And, of course, Michael Allen Williams' Rethinking Gnosticism. I do not agree with his position that Gnosticism is a busted category, but nevertheless, this book is a fantastic understanding the problems in Gnostic and Hermetic studies. So, you asked, is Hermeticism the nicer pagan cousin of Christian Gnosticism? They are very dear to my heart. And, well, first, have you accepted Hermes Thrice Greatest as your personal Hierophant and Psychopomp?
Sometimes I do. I like to leave my options open, just in case.
Me too, man. Gnosticism and Hermeticism, my like for Hermeticism is specific. It's for its own sake, rather than similarities to other systems. They're similar. It's distinct from Christian Gnosticism. Hermeticism, or Hermetism is the academic term, is Gnostic in an adjectival and not a denominational sense. It seeks to inspire enlightenment and uses the term gnosis to denote that enlightenment. I have personally lapsed into Hermetic devotion, usually over the summertime for some reason. And, I think it's a really powerful and effective symbolic language for spiritual contemplation. This summer, however, my contemplation was geared towards Hebrew mysticism, because I'm taking Hebrew and Old Testament studies after all. So what you want to know, man?
Why don't we get down to the central origins of it, the history. What are the origins of Hermeticism, as far as you know?
Okay. The origins are essentially an Egyptian religiosity through the lens of Greek Platonism and Greek culture. It has its origins in post-Christian pagan religiosity of the first few centuries. Hermes Trismegistus is not the Greek god Hermes, but a synthesis of the Greek god Hermes with the Egyptian god of wisdom thought. Apparently, Egyptian religiosity saw much of Hermes' domain as divine messenger to be identical to Thoth's role as prophet and luminary, so they seem to jive together. The literature shows strong similarities to Greek and Judeo-Christian writing of the time, leading some scholars like Walter Scott and Garth Faldin to suggest a thematic connection between the two bodies of literature, probably because of cultural mixing in Egypt, which was a culture of sinners, I'm sure you know. For instance, the use of pseudepigrapha, the Corpus Hermeticum, the body of Hermetic text that we interface with today, uses Tat, Hermes, and other related characters, similar to books like Daniel or Enoch, in being attributed to an authoritative author. Here the authoritative author would be Hermes. It is sometimes suspected Hermetism has roots in the first centuries BC. I guess this is possible that Egyptian religiosity began to synthesize with Platonist ideas around then because of the Ptolemaic Greek presence in Egypt. But the corpus itself did not materialize until the Roman period, after the turn of the millennium. There's absolutely zero textual evidence of a Corpus Hermeticum or similar literature existing before the birth of Christ. In the Egyptian Hermes, page 11, Garth Faldin states that the earliest that any of the extant Hermetica can be dated is the 2nd century. He's open to the possibility, like I am, that texts resembling the corpus were in circulation as early as the 1st century, but no earlier. The composition of the Hermetica took place over the first few centuries. I don't know if it can be described as having peaked in this time. The literature might have been specific to teacher-student scenarios, or perhaps even the musings of the religious populace. I'm not sure. There aren't really any official records that I'm aware of. Garth Faldin insists that the Hermetica show us a literate, but not particularly educated, view of Greek and Egyptian religiosity. So despite Hermetic roots in antiquity, it doesn't really appear that Hermetism flourished widely during the pagan Roman Empire. It seems to have been one of many. But whatever the Hermetica's roots in pagan antiquity, among the intelligentsia or among the common people, it achieved a great deal of respect among early Christians, and later the Byzantine Empire, as a source of contemplation worthy of Christian consideration. In the 4th century, for example, the Christian thinker Lachman was openly a Christian Hermetic, and mostly sought to reconcile Hermetist and Christian doctrines. And nobody thought this was weird. He was, allowed to do this. The Armenian Church sought to Hellenize their church with Hermetic writings. Did you know that?
No, wow.
And
that's quite a bombshell.
And in the Armenian Church, the Hermetic writings that they used seem to have been about half and half pagan authors from the past and contemporary Christian authors that were embellishing it. There were Christians in the medieval period sitting around writing Hermetic texts. So ultimately, though, we really owe the Byzantines for the preservation of Hermeticism. It's in the Byzantine Empire that the corpus as we know it was compiled and edited. Faldin says that the material most compatible with Christian doctrine is what is being represented in the corpus. The Hermetic corpus is, ironically, a Christian compilation. These texts were authored by pagan authors, but it was compiled by Christian people. You might think that this group of texts that we have extant represents the texts that medieval Christians most thought sort of jived with their own theology.
Yeah, but how exactly did it jive with their own theology? I mean, what attracted them to the Hermetic worldview?
It's very theological. If you've ever read Corpus Hermeticum, I'm sure you have. If you just turn to if you turn to Corpus Hermeticum 13, the themes and vocabulary are so similar to the Gospel of John. It's almost as if Corpus Hermeticum 13 is like a pagan version of the same gospel. It's very cool, in my opinion, that they share similar themes like that. But I bet you did not know that 2 later manuscripts of the corpus actually attribute the authorship of the entire corpus to the Byzantine Emperor Michael Pacellus in the 11th century. And
that's pretty heavy stuff.
Well, we know it's bunk because the writings are recorded during the first few centuries. But it's kind of a revealing datum in that it shows the appeal the corpus had for Christian people. This is an elusive fact in modern times, because we don't realize that in the ancient world, Hermetic texts really spoke to Christian people. So Hermeticism was tolerated as a legitimate mental discipline for Christians in the Holy Roman Empire. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, Hermetism had become so conflated with Christian thought that can effectively be described as a type of Christian tradition of itself. Alchemy, I'm sure you know from when you're young, thoroughly integrates Hermetic symbols with the Christian area. It's kind of counterintuitive that a pagan tradition would be so zealously guarded and transmitted by Christian people. There you have it, man. That's the way it worked. Gnosis has been a hot topic among Christians for millennia. Just not the Gnostic Gnosis, but the Hermetic Gnosis.
Basically, what happened to the Hermeticists? I mean, were they simply absorbed into Christian thought, or what happened to them?
I'm drawing a blank on that one, homeboy. I'm not sure. It's just the empire gradually Christianized. I don't know if you know the word pagan means hick, means rural person. Yeah. So, as the country was gradually Christianized, I'm sure that Hermeticism disappeared. It existed among Christians for a long time. They really jived on it. As early as the 4th century, which is really cool.
Jesse, the Neoplatonists and other pagans disliked, the classic Christian Gnostics as much as they disliked all other Christian sects. Did the Hermeticists have a better light in the Greco-Roman world, or?
This is a hard one to answer. We don't have a ton of official state records regarding Hermetists. If we have any secondary information like this, I'm not aware of it. I mean, I'm sure it's out there somewhere, but you're going to ask Garth Fowden, Slatko Plesha, John Turner. If I were to wager a guess, I'd say that the Hermetists were generally immune to religious persecution of pagan authorities. This theory relies on, of course, Hermetist attitudes towards Roman state religion. Were they unwilling to burn incense to the emperor, like Jews and Christians? Did they ever establish state-critical cults? It's considerations like these that would inform my response on this question. If I were to make an educated guess, I'd say they were pretty well left alone. Corpus Hermeticum 18, after all, even Hermetic material, but it is a panegyric, which is like a praise text, of unnamed Roman emperors. So I'm going to wager a guess and say that the Hermetists did not have a huge cultural gap between them and the state. I don't know if ancient pagan compilers included this material or if later Christian compilers did, but perhaps it might represent less tension between Hermetic culture and the Roman state. Much less tension than between Christianity and the Roman state. But remember, Miguel, just because we don't have contemporary textual evidence to confirm something's existence does not mean it did not exist. There may have been some sort of state interference with Hermetists, but they may have simply been low enough on the radar not to provoke an official written response during the time. Like a Jewish carpenter I can think of who also lacks contemporary resources.
Yeah. Well, why don't we just say Constantine had him all killed off and close the chapter on it?
Let's put it in terms of good guys and bad guys. It makes it easier on the brain.
Yeah. It's always so easier just to deal with it. They were killed off. Christians were evil. Let's go on.
There were some car chases in there and some shit exploded. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, exactly.
Pardon my French.
You can say anything in the show. But moving on, how does the Hermetic cosmology and cosmogony differ from their Christian brethren, the Christian Gnostics?
This is a very cool question. Hermetism has two basic theological bodies of literature. They have essentially pantheist, panentheist view, that the world is all an extension of gradual divine emanation, and the more dualist, transcendent view, that the world is like a worm to a worm to a worm to a worm to God. Like God is just so transcendent and so much bigger and more spiritual and more powerful and more good than the universe that we can't even approach this without some sort of savior figure. Garth Fowden, the author of the Egyptian Hermes, and one of the most important current scholars of Hermetism, suggests that they're both true in classical Hermetism. The pantheist, panentheist view is true in a local cosmic sense, emphasizing God's immanence in creation. And the dualist materials put that in the perspective of God's absolute transcendence. So Fowden thinks that they're both true. They're just two different perspectives, two tiers on the Enlightenment scale. It's also possible, I suppose, that they just represent two doctrinal schools within Hermetism. I mean, I'm willing to consider that. Like Gnosticism, Hermetism was not a unified doctrine. I should point out that in Gnosticism's heyday, Christianity wasn't very unified either. Gnosticism did not go up against a monolithic church. That did not exist in the time that it was doing its thing. Hermetism was a teacher-centric system, and there's variations in teachings throughout the corpus. Christian Gnosticism, what we refer to generally on the palm tree garden as capital G Gnosticism, is more related to the second body of Hermetist doctrines, the dualist tractates in the Corpus Hermeticum. This family of texts is pretty concerned with morality of the body as a means to purify oneself, with the Gnostic theme. Though emphasized differently, the themes of both immanence and transcendence are found in both Gnosticism and Hermetism. That said, there's a lot of terminological similarities with Gnosticism. Hermetist texts are often interested in archons and the agency of the demiurge. I mean, it's viewed in a more Platonist, positive way than the Gnostics viewed them.
In Hermeticism, the demiurge is actually more of a benign being. He's an extension of the absolute power without any corruption or anything like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. He's a much more neutral sort of thing. Hermetist texts take a tone similar to Judeo-Christian prophetic writings. And some texts even show a sense of awareness of Judeo-Christian prophetic scripture. The similarities can be traced back to the Platonist schools found underlying both traditions. It can be argued that both draw two traditional synthetic pools, the Judeo-Christian on one hand and the Platonist on the other. Christian Gnosticism emphasizes the Judeo-Christian, while Hermetism emphasizes the Platonist Hellenic. It might be fair, instead of calling Gnosticism and Hermetism the same tradition, to call them sister traditions or brother traditions. How about sibling traditions? Can we go with that? Is that cool?
Sounds good to me. But Jesse, we talk about Hermes Trismegistus, again, this syncretic figure who is the savior figure as well. But I believe in the Poimandres, really salvation has nothing to do with any savior. Salvation is simply found on your own, isn't it?
You say that, but the title of the text is The Shepherd Man. So
but isn't the Shepherd Man really God?
The Shepherd Man is a sort of divine figure. The Shepherd Man is a sort of divine messenger. I don't think you can divorce Hermetism or Gnosticism from the idea of a saving figure. Then the Gnostics and the Hermetists always rely on a salvific luminary figure to enlighten us. Gnosis is never something we can achieve on our own, as is the popular mantra these days. I'm sure you're aware. The Gnostic terms for these figures is teacher, master, and savior. In Hermetism, a teacher who embodies the spirit of the savior is called a hierophant. The savior figure who guides the soul to union with God is called the psychopomp. The Hermetic savior is Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes thrice gross. He is the salvific psychopomp of the Hermetists. He educates his son Tat, who appears to be human, more or less like you and I. He's partially divine, or to Asclepius, the Greek demigod and healer. A handful of other Hermetic texts make use of, interestingly enough, Egyptian figures like Isis and Horus. You can find that at the end of the Knock edition of Kore Cosmu, which is the eye people of the world. It's a pretty cool text.
Yeah, and basically the story, again in more benign terms, is man or the divine man falls into matter. Matter kind of falls in love with him, and he takes on the clothing of matter, and is suddenly, basically, again in more benign terms, trapped in this world, and therefore must unclothe himself and go back up through the heavens to the absolute power. Is that a good snapshot of the situation we're in?
That's a pretty good snapshot. Oh, what's interesting about that particular snapshot is you couldn't say that it was a Hermetist snapshot. You couldn't say that it was a Gnostic snapshot. That's a snapshot that the ancient Greeks had. That's what they believed. That's what Platonists believed. When Greek culture started to put away the polytheism, or old modes of polytheism, and they started to embrace more philosophical, theological approaches in the first couple centuries BC and the first couple centuries AD. They started to move towards Platonist science rather than, polytheistic sort of religion. And that that description that you gave is a pretty good description of a cross-cultural point of view at the time.
And I guess their concept of gnosis is pretty much in line with Christian Gnosticism. Self-knowledge, discovery of one's own divinity, and then what's next? Rituals and the mysteries?
I'm actually going to just cop out of this question and quote the Corpus Hermeticum, if that's all right.
Hey, let's go directly to the horse's mouth.
Yeah, let's go straight to the horse's mouth and pull something out. This is the hymn from Corpus Hermeticum 13. This is my own translation. Like I said earlier, Corpus Hermeticum 13 is just so cool. This hymn could almost be an appendix to the Gospel of John. It's very flexible. The gnosis of God has come to us, and at its coming, ignorance has been driven out. Truth has come to us, and with it has followed the good, with life and light. No longer has there come upon us the torments of darkness. They have flown away with rushing wings. Thus has the mind been made up in us, and by its coming we have been given sight. Whoever then has by God's mercy attained to this divine birth, abandons bodily sense, he knows himself to be comprised of powers of God, and knowing, we rejoice. God has made me a new being, and I perceive things now, not by bodily eyesight, but by the working of mind. Being born again, I see holy things by seeing things holy. Now that I see in mind, I see myself to be the all. I am in heaven and earth, in water and air. I'm in beasts and plants. I am a babe in the womb, and one that has not yet been conceived, one that has not yet been born. I am present everywhere. This is the rebirth. Can I get an amen in here?
Amen, brother.
Amen.
That is beautiful, beautiful stuff.
I think there are a lot of important similarities here. Like I said before, the Corpus is comprised of the two theological camps. The Gnostics are generally more dualist than the panentheist camp. But the differences in emphasis do overlap between traditions. Like, open your Bentley Leighton's Gnostic Scriptures, page, I think it's 252, I'll pull that off the top of my head. It states that gospel truth resembles more of a pantheist theology than other, more obviously dualist Gnostic texts. On our forum, the Palm Tree Garden, as I'm sure you're aware, my good friends and I have argued over our personal feelings on this matter of the emphasis for transcendence versus immanence. We've argued this at length. This is like a real hot topic. Is the universe a part of God? Is spirit simply present in it? It's hard to resolve. It's hard to resolve with the material we have, Hermetist and Gnostic. If you want my personal take on it, I'll endorse the Jewish concept of Zimzum. I think it's a very decent type concept. It's the idea that God made a sort of like non-God space within himself by contracting his divine power out of a place.
Oh yeah,
he made in
from
himself.
Isaac Luria, yeah.
Yeah, very cool stuff. That's my favorite explanation of this question. Ironically, the Christian compilers were very zealous to incorporate Hermetist material, and plenty were intellectually hostile to Gnosticism. But Egyptian Gnosis found a legitimate back door into Christianity and has been lurking in the rec room this time, eating our Cheetos and drinking all our beer.
But I guess another question, Jesse, is, in Christianity or Christian Gnosticism, we have historical figures like St. Paul, Valentinus, and a whole cadre of others. Do we have any evidence of Hermetic thinkers that might be historical?
If you mean like legendary teachers like Valentinus or Basilides, unfortunately we really don't, because all this stuff was written as pseudepigrapha. It's written in somebody else's name. Most of our knowledge about Hermetism comes from the Hermeticum, and the secondary source, Stobaeus' Hermetic fragments, which were compiled in the 5th century. The Byzantine Emperor Michael Pacellus might be considered an honorary Hermetic adept because of his work bringing the text into the medieval Christian world. Speaking of those texts, you wanted to know what Holy Writ the Hermeticists use. It's basically the Corpus Hermeticum that we have today. But like I said, the corpus seems to have been compiled largely by Christian admirers. Stobaeus, as I mentioned, also compiled a large amount of Hermetic material. There's a great amount of material with other compilations as well. Most likely, a lot of material we just don't have recorded anymore. As for whether the Hermetists had an authoritative body of scripture, I'm not sure, but the variations in the text suggest to me two schools, like we talked about. The roots of the corpus seem to rely on both theology and an Egyptian sense of religious experience. The cosmologies are decidedly classic, and the attitude and tone is decidedly Egyptian.
What do you mean by Egyptian?
If you read the introduction to Fowden or to the Walter Scott edition of the Corpus Hermeticum, they'll talk a little bit about what Egyptian religiosity was like. Egyptian religiosity was very personal. It was at the same time very congregational because you'd bring your personal revelations to other people. But it was very personal. It's very ecstatic. Okay? Very emotional. It's very moving. At the same time, this sort of emotional, moving, ecstatic religious experience is being balanced by very philosophical disciplines. They were very, very balanced people, in my opinion.
You mentioned again the Corpus Hermeticum being their holy writ. Don't we find some hermetical texts in the Nag Hammadi library?
We sure do. We find them in the Sixth Codex. This is the most diverse codex in the Nag Hammadi, showing texts from diverse traditions, including Platonism and Hermetism. The included Hermetist texts are the Discourse on the 8th and the 9th, the Prayer of Thanksgiving, and an excerpt from the text of Asclepius. It appears from the compilation of the Codex that the Codex was compiled by Pagan Gnostic, in my opinion, likely a Valentinian. The scribal note in the Codex might suggest that the texts were compiled arbitrarily. There's this funny little note in there that's like, I know you're sick of hearing about this, and I don't know if you've received these, but I'm writing them down anyway. Just let me know if I need to stop. It's pretty funny. Because you might think they were arbitrary, but in chapter 11 of Michael Allen Williams' Recent Gnosticism, this is a great chapter. He talks about the breakdown of each codex. Williams reiterates Jean-Pierre Mahé's position that the codex can only be read in terms of the surrounding context, the context of Christian Gnosticism. The compilers, Mahé suggests, include the material because it's complementary to Gnostic thought. The inclusion of the Asclepius passages, for instance, is likely context for the remark in the first text in the Codex, the Acts of Peter and the 12 Apostles, where Jesus is shown to be a doctor with a medicine box, just like Asclepius. This might show the reader that Jesus had appeared in a previous revelation disguised as a pagan figure, or it might simply be included for the other similarities to Gnostic texts. It's a hard question. Regardless, there's been an impulse to include Hermetist material in Christian thought for a long time, and perhaps the Gnostics were the forerunners of this trend. Perhaps they got it going. As for the texts themselves, the Discourse on the 8th and the 9th is the most interesting to me personally. It was included undoubtedly because of the similar views Gnostics had to the Hermetists regarding the archons and planetary spheres. In both Gnostic and Hermetist thought, after you ascend through the seven spheres which represent the passions, you've conquered the material world and you're ready for spiritual understanding. The 8th and 9th spheres, then, are the spheres of spiritual enlightenment, as opposed to material enlightenment. A prayer of thanksgiving does not look very Hermetist or Gnostic at all. It lacks a lot of the technical jargon. That would be a dead giveaway. But the theme of inducing divinity in oneself through mystical sense is here, and in terms ironically close to Christian terms. They use terms like Father and Son, the Logos, etc. This prayer might have been said by both Hermetists and Gnostics, like Corpus Hermeticum 13, that passage I quoted. It could definitely overlap. And then finally, Asclepius. If I could toot my own horn, blab on about my personal theories. I think the beginning of this text, concerned with union with God as analogous to the mystery of sexual union, is included because of its parallels to Valentinian sexual theories in the Gospel of Philip. The relationship between the soul and God is like a sexual relationship. And you sort of are supposed to marry yourself, marry your soul to God. And in this text, we see that theme repeated in the Valentinian text, the Gospel of Philip. We also see this theme repeated. There's even a ritual included in the Gospel of Philip, the bridal chamber ritual, which I'm sure you've heard about, which was something like, in order to dilute the inherent badness in sexual behavior. It's a very, these people were afraid of the passions of the body, and sexual behavior was very passionate. It was very lustful. It was very material. So the Valentinians would sort of have this prayer ritual when you were, having sex, that you would perform to produce good children. You try to purify yourself of all the lust and try to produce a kid. Spiritual intentions. I think that this passage from Asclepius has a lot of similarities with that. The rest of the text involves the prediction of the gods' desertion of Egypt, a description of idols and man-made gods, and then the description of Greek gods as archonic rulers. The most likely reason this text was included, besides my own theories, is the prophecy predicting the end of Egyptian religion for a new religious order. I think that the Christians would totally jump at this. It says, Egyptians will seem to have served the divinity in vain, and all their activity and religion will be despised. All divinity will leave Egypt and flee upward to heaven, and Egypt will be widowed. It will be abandoned by the gods. Foreigners will come into Egypt and rule it. Egypt. Moreover, Egyptians will be prohibited from worshiping God. Furthermore, they will have come into the ultimate punishment, especially whoever among them is found worshiping and honoring God. And in that day, the country that was more pious than all countries will become impious. No longer will it be full of temples. It will be full of tombs. Neither will it be full of gods. It will be full of corpses. Egypt will become like the fables.
That's juicy stuff for Christians, Muslims, or whoever can get their hands on that.
Yeah, well, you could see how, I mean, the ancient world was, a milieu of xenophobic cultures. So I could see how ancient Christian Gnostics would have thought this was really cool. Here these people are predicting their own pagan demise.
Exactly.
They jumped all over that. The ancient mind would have loved it. As we both know, though, pagan culture never really died. It adapted to the new Christian paradigm and continued to exist underneath the surfaces, science, philosophy. This allowed for the transmission of pagan Hermetism among Christian thinkers for 2,000 years. And I think for this, we're thankful.
What about the misconception? I think we've talked about this, that the Hermetics were just these magic users who practice religion tacitly. Is that a big misconception? I guess brought about by the Renaissance and all these occultists and stuff like that.
I said that there were two theological camps within the philosophical Hermetica. But there's also another genre of Hermetica called the magical Hermetica. It doesn't look from the Corpus Hermeticum that those Hermetists were all about magic. It doesn't seem like it's not a prominent theme. Sorcery is looked at, with disdain. But there's still a body of magical Hermetica out there. And in the ancient world, Hermes was seen as a sort of magical god. I think it might be a different genre of Hermetica than we've been talking about in this discussion, but it definitely is there. It definitely is there.
Could you tell the listener maybe of the story of how Hermeticism was revived in the Renaissance?
That's really not my area of expertise. I'm an ancient scholar. I study the ancient Mediterranean. I know that it was preserved in the Byzantine Empire. It was legitimate and tolerated in the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, that's just a leapfrog into the Renaissance. You know what I mean? That's like a channel that it followed to get us into the Renaissance. How it specifically got there, I don't really know, man. I'm going to have to go back and study some Renaissance Hermetic studies before we can answer that one.
And but I know they were pretty intelligent back in the medieval times or the Renaissance, in which some people claim that Hermes Trismegistus had actually interacted with Moses and all this.
Oh,
stuff.
yeah. Well,
they were
people
able
like
to get around the church.
People like to tell stories, man. That's part of human experience. One point that I want to make about Hermetism that I think is particularly wild is that it seems to have been downplayed in the pagan atmosphere as sort of rural thing. I mean, like snooty Platonists sitting around in their universities are like looking down at Hermetists as people that are kind of rural, right? Pagani, if you will. And then 3 centuries later, after this stuff is written, Christians are holding up Hermetism as like the height of pagan culture. Very cool. Hermetism was far more accepted in Christian culture than it was accepted in pagan culture.
And these days, it's like you said, their influence is there. I mean, the concept "as above, so below." The Wiccans have kind of adopted it to their own, but that's Hermetical thought.
Yeah, it sure is. Sure is. It as above, so below. I think that's from Ficino in the 13th, 14th century. I'm not sure. It's not classical Hermeticism, or if it's derived from classical Hermeticism. But I didn't write all that down, so I'm not sure.
Well, according to Philip K. Dick, it was Hermes Trismegistus talking through Apollonius of Tyana who said it.
Oh, yeah? Yeah, well, that might be where Ficino got it.
That's in Valis.
Well, when you go to school, you don't learn everything. You learn that you don't know anything. So, the more questions you ask, the more research I got to do.
You are known primarily as a scholar of occultism in modern times. What exactly inspired you to write a book on such an ancient figure?
Well, I had written a book called Politics and the Occult. Part of that book dealt with understanding some of the political implications of a school of contemporary esoteric or spiritual thought called the Traditionalists. René Guénon and Fritjof Schuon and Julius Evola and some other figures. And sort of the central theme uniting these different writers and thinkers is the idea that there was some primordial tradition, some primordial knowledge or wisdom or ancient teaching that was revealed to mankind in the dim, dark past. This sort of primordial tradition, which became sort of known as the perennial philosophy or the pristine theology, it was this initial originary primal kind of revelation of the truth, and then over time it later got sort of filtered down and sort of separated into all the different religions that we know: Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and so on. But uniting all of them was the idea that there was some ancient teaching that was the central one from which they all kind of came. That idea seems to have originated with this figure called Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great as Hermes. Hermes great, 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 as Tony the Tiger used to say about Frosted Flakes when I was a kid. And so I just became very interested in this character and this whole idea. And then when I started to look into it, and anyone who's interested in the occult and esotericism and all of these, the inner tradition of the West and all these sort of teachings, they know who Hermes Trismegistus is. He's this character who's supposed to be one of the great sort of creators of magic and civilization and writing and thinking and so on. I became interested in who this character was, because when you look into it, you realize that for a great many centuries, he was a revered figure. At certain times, he was considered to be an actual real person, other times a god, other times a sort of human, half god, a magician, and so on and so on. But in the early 1600s, it was seen or found out that actually there was no figure like this at all. It's more or less an invention of certain spiritual groups and devotees in the centuries, first or second centuries following Christ, who invented this sort of character. And so you can see in sort of the history of ideas, suddenly he loses complete credibility, and the Hermetic teachings and the Hermetic philosophy and the character of Hermes Trismegistus himself suddenly drops down to be seen as mere superstition. And the whole school of Hermeticism, that for many years had been considered prestigious and up there with Plato and Jesus and Moses and all of the other sort of big hitters of Western civilization at the time, he becomes a kind of charlatan figure, this fool in some ways, and his followers are seen to be sort of just mere followers of superstition. And that's when the whole sort of Western esoteric tradition goes underground. So I just became fascinated with that whole sort of shift in our thought. How you have it's almost as if someone like Einstein, let's say, or Stephen Hawking, let's say, the smartest man in the world, who can sort of say important things about everything. It's as if 200 years from now, people at that time figured out they were completely wrong, or even decided they didn't exist, and suddenly their street cred collapses and goes down to nothing. So I just was fascinated with that whole kind of shift, because in many ways our modern world, our modern times, begin, the whole sensibility that informs modernity begins at the same time as the Hermetic teaching, and this figure of Hermes Trismegistus goes into eclipse.
And the question also would be, Gary, is, as your book points out, Hermes was respected, revered, and at least accepted in early Christendom, in the Byzantine Empire, in medieval times. How exactly did this pagan figure become so part of, like you say, the pantheon of the other luminaries in the Christian dispensation? I mean, how did he get away with it?
Well, there were, various different thinkers and philosophers and theologians in the Christian tradition, going back to Clement of Alexandria, one of the early church fathers, up into the Renaissance. People like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola and others, who wanted to somehow find a place for the Hermetic philosophy within Christianity, within Christian philosophical thinking. And they also wanted to find a place for Plato. They basically wanted to find a place for the Greek philosophers and what were known at the time as the pagan philosophers. When the early church, or the church up into the Renaissance, refers to pagans, it's not talking about sort of people here in England that go out to the forest and sort of try, well, I'm not in any way dismissing them, but it's not that kind of Wicker Man paganism. It's not the kind of nature mysticism. It's the Greek Neoplatonic philosophy that they considered pagan. And there were many within the church who were, very intelligent thinkers who realized there was much of value in that, and people like Plato were seen to be precursors of Christianity. I mean, there was no doubt that Christianity and Christ was sort of the culmination, the final sort of part of the dialectic, let's say. But earlier than that, you have these pagan thinkers that, in abstract terms or mythological terms, we're talking about the same sorts of things. So you find thinkers in this period seeing parallels between some of the Hermetic, Platonic philosophies and some of the things in Christianity. And there was even a time during the Renaissance when there were Christian thinkers advocating the inclusion of the figure of Hermes Trismegistus within sort of the canon, the Christian canon, as being kind of one of the prophets, let's say, of Christ or something like that. So this is to suggest how important this figure of Hermes Trismegistus was, and also how for a certain time in the West, in Christianity, there was a possibility when what we today see as the sort of strange woo-woo weird world of the occult and mysticism and esotericism was actually being promoted as something that could be an active living part of the whole sort of Western consciousness.
Yeah, and he even survived the barbed words of Augustine, didn't he?
Yeah, well, Augustine took argument with the Hermetic philosophy and Hermes Trismegistus, especially. He wasn't aware of the what we know as the Corpus Hermeticum, but he did know a book called the Asclepius, which was one of the longer Hermetic books. And what Augustine didn't like was that in the Asclepius is sort of instructions on how to animate statues, how to sort of bring statues to life, to kind of the whole idea, this notion of sort of bringing the gods down, the god force down, and infusing it into these figures that are made, and then these become animate. This was something that Augustine thought was sort of devilish, or I guess what we would consider satanic or black magic. But at the same time, he also recognized, even by arguing against, he recognized the importance of this character Hermes Trismegistus. So again, you have people like Augustine, Clement of Alexandria, and others within the church recognizing how important this figure is. And then you, as I said, you have in the early 1600s, suddenly it becomes clear that, well, actually, he's not what everybody thought he was. It would be the equivalent if today, let's say, somebody figured out that, well, sort of the thing that goes on with, the Da Vinci Code or whatever. This whole idea that, what we thought was the case turned out not to be, and the effect that has on, consciousness, in the Western consciousness in general.
And in your research, Gary, and obviously most scholars or most conservative scholars would say that Hermeticism began around the 2nd century after Christ. What do you think are the origins, the historical origins for Hermeticism?
Well, I mean, I think that term Hermeticism starts up around then, or maybe a little bit earlier. I think that in that sense that's a correct assessment. But the ideas, the knowledge, the wisdom that is being transmitted in Hermeticism, as you say, probably goes back earlier. And in the book, I speculate on. Well, one of the things I do in the book is for myself try to answer. Well, what is this Egyptian wisdom? You hear stories about Plato going to school in Egypt and Pythagoras before him, and the whole idea that everybody back then, it had to be part of their sort of curriculum vitae that they went to Egypt and sat at the foot of the priests there and learned something. Much like today, when people go backpacking off into some third world country in search of the indigenous shamans or whatever, or in the 60s and 70s going out to India to meet the gurus there. So there seemed to be something like that going on then. So I just got myself thinking, well, what is this Egyptian wisdom that you hear so much about in books about magic and the occult and so on, and esotericism? And I speculate on a few different things. What it might be. I draw on the work of a brilliant writer named Jeremy Nadler, who develops this notion of sort of Egyptian shamanism, that in the ancient Egyptian time, the priests performed rituals or participated in ceremonies that were very much like what we understand shamanistic practices to be, and the central theme around this is the idea of awaking as part of the Egyptian. The Egyptian had a very complex notion of the soul of the human being. There's like it's 8 parts, but there's one in particular that relates to this. Is something called the Ak, and the Ak is this kind of immaterial, immortal, undying, spiritual kind of essence that one can come to awareness of in life itself through certain rituals and practices. And Nadler presents the idea that the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which most mainstream Egyptologists see as basically a funerary text, something to be read over the dead body, over the mummy, or whatever, and so on. And Nadler says, yes, it probably was used like that, but it was also, he believes, used as a kind of meditative, sort of instruction book, a kind of rough guide to experiencing the underworld, what the Egyptians called the duat, while still alive, without having to actually physically die. And this, Nadler argues, is an idea that gets picked up by Plato or appears in Plato. The whole notion, Socrates argues in the Credo, and also the Apologia, the notion that basically philosophy is a kind of discipline in which you practice dying. You learn how to die. You learn how to die to the physical external world while still alive, in order to awaken what the Hermeticists called nous, this mind, this kind of immortal, immaterial, universal mind that we all participate in. So, I mean, looking at some of the things that Nadler talks about, also looking at some of the work of René Schwaller-de Lubitsch and his ideas about what he calls symbolique, which was what he thought was happening with Egyptian hieroglyphics, in the sense that the kind of figures that the hieroglyphics are composed of, they served two purposes. They served they denoted things. They sort of pointed to things as language does. This particular whatever figure meant that sort of thing, but they also evoked. They also could trigger this sort of broader consciousness that Swaljig Lubitsch called the intelligence of the heart, where you have this intuitive, participatory experience of what the Egyptians called the netters, these sort of cosmic forces in the world. And so looking at that, comparing those sorts of ideas with some of the things that are said in the Corpus Hermeticum, this collection of Hermetic writings that more than likely were written in the first few centuries after Christ, and later resurfaced 1,000 years or so later in the Renaissance. Looking at some of the things that are talked about in there, I see some parallels. So the reason I'm going into this is to suggest that yes, indeed, even though these texts were written in first, second, third century after Christ, they seem to look back to or they seem to be informed by a set of metaphysical, psychological, esoteric ideas that go much further back and seem to have an Egyptian origin.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Gary, because it was Valentinus who called gnosis the knowledge of the heart, and you mentioned the Egyptians call it the intelligence of the heart. You also call Hermeticism the religion of the mind. You're basically saying that to the Hermetic, who are probably maybe the closest bridge we have to the really alien consciousness of the Egyptians, which we probably will never be able to understand, and the Greeks wanted to understand, but is a way of completely, what you might say, gaining the full access of our lower and higher mind and expanding our consciousness to its extremes, right?
Well, yes. I mean, the sort of the central idea in Hermeticism is this notion of gnosis. We know gnosis is associated with another philosophical spiritual school at the time called the Gnostics, or the Gnosticism. But they both were very much centered on this idea, and it's a Greek word for knowledge. For the Hermeticists, what this gnosis was experience of the nous, experience of this universal mind. There is the fundamental, really real thing in existence is this mind, and we participate in it. It's all around us. The Hermeticists have this notion, this idea they call the one, the all, which, when you think about it, makes a lot of sense, because the only one that we could conceive of in the world that we live in would have to be the entire world itself, because within that collection of things, basically everything, there's multiplicity, there's diversity, there's all different sorts of things. So for us to in any way comprehend the one, it would have to be at the same time comprehending the all. And for the Hermeticists, this was the basic kind of movement or direction of their spiritual practices and of their meditative work. And in the book, I try to relate it to this idea that, or this notion that starts up in the early 20th century, cosmic consciousness. Now we know in the 60s, this kind of phrase, cosmic consciousness, got picked up and used, for basically anything that was groovy. But in the early 1900s, 1901, I think, in fact, a fellow named Richard Morris Buck, who was a psychologist in Canada, he wrote a book called Cosmic Consciousness, in which he basically argues that the human race was evolving into this wider, deeper, more profound, more expanded form of consciousness. And he traces throughout history different examples of that, the Buddha, Christ, lots of other sorts of people that are in there. And he himself talks about an experience he had. Now, what struck me about this was that the way that Buck described his own experience of cosmic consciousness and the descriptions of it with others, I mean, especially people who read Buck's book. One was William James, who experimented with nitrous oxide and had other sort of mystical experiences. And another was P.D. Uspensky, who's best known as being, Gurdjieff's brightest student, but was a very important, insightful thinker in his own right. He, having read Buck, and also having read William James and the variety of religious experience, he too experiments with nitrous oxide and has very similar experiences. And this sort of cosmic consciousness, the way they all describe it, it says suddenly they become aware of basically everything going on around them in very minute and vivid detail. They all describe it as this kind of flood of information. In some ways, there's nothing very mystical about it. It's not a vision of something supernatural. It's not a visitation by Christ or Buddha or Krishna or anything like that. It's basically becoming aware of a huge amount of facts, of knowledge. Too much, actually, for them to handle at any one time. I was just struck by the way Buck, William James, Ouspensky described their experiences and how it seemed to relate and parallel the way that Gnosis is described in the Hermetic books. And that was exciting for me because it made me feel like, well, here's these guys back in, first, second, third century talking about their experiences. And then you have these modern accounts of the same sort of thing. And so I'm always very thrilled when I find parallels and similar accounts about our inner world and our inner experiences coming from different sources, because that sort of reaffirms my notion that we're actually talking about something real. These different from totally different times in history, totally different cultures and backgrounds, but the description of the experience is very similar. And again, as you say, it has to do with this notion of the sense of mind.
Yeah, you give plenty of really great examples. For example, Hermann Hesse and Aldous Huxley, and it seems the point is whatever you need to do to get to that state of consciousness, go ahead and do it. We really don't know, but we really don't know what the rituals were of the ancient Hermetics, do we?
Mm-hmm. No, there's some speculation.
Didn't do whatever Aldous Huxley did. I forgot what.
Well, the thing is, I mean, it's probably easier for us now because we could go get whatever ayahuasca or mescaline, or Huxley took mescaline. Hermann Hesse's experience is different in the sense that he didn't. He's describing the experiences of his character Harry Haller in the novel Steppenwolf. Steppenwolf is this middle-aged intellectual who's basically given up on life, and he's basically, the novel is him avoiding going home because if he goes home he's going to slit his throat, and so he tries to keep himself away from the razor, but he does have these moments when suddenly this tension that he's living under and this kind of excruciating boredom relaxes, and he has this experience of he's somehow vividly aware of other times in his life. The same sort of thing happens in the Remembrance of Things Past, the huge novel by Marcel Proust, and famously the character in the novel tastes a bit of a biscuit or cake dipped in this kind of tea, and it suddenly reminds him of his childhood, and he's thrown back into this other time. And it's not as if he just sort of knows that oh yes, I was here at this place when I was 10 years old. He's there again. It's living, it's alive, it's in 3D, as sadly most movies are today, and HD and all that. But this relates too to this Hermetic notion of becoming God. To me, one of the most tremendously thrilling passages in the Hermetic books is this one in which it's either Nous, the universal mind, talking to Hermes, or there's Hermes talking to his disciples, his students. This is one of the early forms of the kind of teacher-student, guru chela kind of structure in these writings. But he's saying that if you want to experience gnosis, if you want to know God, you must become like God, and that means to exist in all points of your life. At the same time, be the fetus in the womb, be the the body rotting in the grave, be the young man, be the the mature man, but also be everything else. There's this tremendous sense of participating in everything. Hence this notion of cosmic consciousness, and this is something that Hesse's character, Harry Haller, and Proust's character in his novel, they both sort of experience. And again, this is interesting for me because neither Hesse or Proust are making any ostensible references to, the Hermetic sort of teachings, but the phenomenology of the experience they're describing is similar, if not exactly the same, as the kind of thing that the Hermetic books are sort of advising, the student to participate. And so again, this notion of religion of the mind, what strikes me about it as interesting, and well, more than interesting, is powerful and excites me, is that it is a kind of religion in the sense that there is a belief in some spiritual reality, some reality beyond the material, but it doesn't depend on any particular kind of rites or hierarchy or structure or ritual or whatever. It's basically coming to understand your own mind, the potentials of your own consciousness. This is what excites me about the Hermetic school, and it's one of the differences, let's say, between the Gnostics and the Hermeticists, who were around at the same time. They knew of each other. We know that some Hermetic texts were found among the Gnostic texts that were discovered at Nag Hammadi in the 1940s, and so we know that certainly, at least the Gnostics were reading some of the Hermetic stuff as well. And one of the differences between the two is that for the Gnostics, there is this kind of paranoia consciousness. There's a kind of conspiracy consciousness, the whole notion of the archons, the whole notion that we live in this false world. We're trapped in this world of matter and space and time that's been created by this idiot, demiurge God, who in the Bible is Yahweh, and who William Blake referred to as Nobo Daddy, and all of this. There's this dark kind of Philip K. Dick sense of there are the others out there who are controlling everything, like the Matrix or something. We have to escape from it. But the Hermeticists don't have that sort of paranoid sensibility about the cosmos. They say, yes, we have to, we are sort of sunk into matter, and what we need to do is actually actualize our own full self, our own full being, our own consciousness, in order to master the world of matter and space and time reality, and to take our rightful place within it, which is that of the caretaker. There's this whole notion that's discussed in more than one of the Hermetic books about man's place as the cosmic caretaker. We're here to sort of help take care of things, to help, similarly to a notion in Kabbalah of tikkun, the whole idea that humanity's job is to repair, the mistakes in creation. When God, whoever created the everything, he actually did a kind of sloppy job, and things broke and things spilled, and there was a mess. And so our job is to kind of clean up the mess. And this was something that the Hermeticists shared with the later sort of Kabbalist thinkers. And there isn't this sense of wanting to escape the cosmos that you get with the Gnostics. I mean, the Gnostics are closer to, say, the sort of the existentialists, or even some more modern esoteric schools like Gurdjieff and the Fourth Way. This notion that we're trapped in a prison, and we have to somehow find a way to burrow our way out. Very different with the Hermeticists.
You do mention, Gary, the Goldilocks effects, in which we have to have one foot in the spiritual world and one foot in the material world. And I would also like, and I often have arguments with people about the difference between gnosis and mysticism. And you put it very well when you say that part of gnosis is having that valve, is to be able to control those archetypal energies that flow through us, or else, well, we can't go to our job. We can't go to our jobs. We can't spend time with it. We've got to keep it in control.
Yeah. Well, yeah. There's the whole the notion that yes, it's great to have these sort of powerful mystical experiences, and or either produced through spiritual practices or through taking some psychoactive substance of some form like that. But as Aldous Huxley, who you mentioned, said while he was under the influence of mescaline, that yes, if everyone took mescaline, there'd be no wars, but there'd be no civilization either. Because Huxley talks about looking over at a sink full of dirty dishes, and which gives you some idea how Huxley lived, and thinking like, well, they were beautiful. There was, and why would you want to go over and wash them? And thankfully, Huxley was a fairly responsible psychedelic imbiber, but I'm sure we all know from experience that many agreed with him. Like, why go wash those dishes? So, in a very practical, simple way, the idea isn't to completely sort of be immersed in this cosmic consciousness all the time, but to draw from the experiences that we do get the knowledge that the universe is a much more fascinating, interesting, living place than we generally take it for. I mean, we have to get on in the world, and Huxley talks about how mind at large has to be sort of siphoned down to a tiny kind of trickle, but it's just the amount of consciousness we need in the trickle in order to deal with things. We seem to have two forms of consciousness. One is to deal with things, which we all need to do, and the other is to appreciate things. I think our problem in the modern world is that we're very successful at dealing with things, and this is why we're, the most dominant species on the planet, and so on and so on. We're able to focus our consciousness and our attention onto, minute specifics, and actually, do things that most, as far as we can tell, most other sort of, living creatures can't do. But the downside of that is that by that sort of funneling of our attention, we lose awareness and consciousness of the sort of rich meaning that's just sort of saturates the world around us. And this is what, when Huxley took mescaline, as he tells us in Doors of Perception, that's more or less what happens. That part of his consciousness, or that kind of consciousness that's focused on dealing with the world, was put out of commission, and suddenly the richness, the sort of meaning that's just soaking in things became available to him, and he could see it. And so but as I said, he had absolutely no inclination to do anything. And this is something that the William James also talks about. William James, talking about his experiences with nitrous oxide, where he felt this complete conviction of this kind of deep metaphysical profundity that he perceived. But he also came to the realization that after spending some time in this sense of the absolute oneness of things, the complete total relation of everything to everything, how everything made sense, there was a sense of sort of indifferentism, because if everything was one, why do one thing rather than another? Why do this rather than that? And so he came, like Huxley, to the conclusion that our consciousness seems to be limited and filtered through necessarily in order for us to kind of go on. And one of the things I propose in the book is this notion that, well, even though most of us tend to enjoy the other form of consciousness, that's why we drink wine or take other sorts of things to relax our sort of dealing with consciousness in order to sink into the other mode, that we need to find some balance, some way to open up this reducing valve enough so that we don't think with so much of modern culture that actually life is meaningless and pointless, and there is no anything out there. It's just sort of atoms floating around meaninglessly, but not too much so that we aren't able to actually function in the world. The point I make in the book, getting back to this notion of gnosis, is I think our job is to translate the insights that one gets in those moments of cosmic consciousness into this other form of knowledge, which we use another Greek word for, episteme, which is the knowledge that we can house in books and libraries, on computers, and so on and so on. And it's a knowledge we can pass on to others. I might have this incredibly ecstatic cosmic experience, but if all I can say to somebody is, oh, wow, they're not going to get a heck of a lot out of it. But if, like Huxley and others who were able to write clearly and logically about their mystical experiences, I can do that and pass that on. That's how knowledge in the broader, larger sense grows. And I think this is, to me, this is one of the important realizations I came to, that the whole idea isn't to go plunge into cosmic consciousness and mystical consciousness and at oneness and stay there. It's, dip your head in for a bit and then come back and tell us all about it.
And there you have it for this special thematic show. You just heard the full interview with Jesse, or Brother Spark, as well as the first half of our interview with Gary Lachman. Become an AB Prime member or patron at Patreon for the full Philosopher's Stone. I wish I could just offer it all for free, but all of this takes resources, even as no one is getting rich from this. Maybe a wealthy patron will come around someday. Only 10% of you subscribe, and the rest is missing out on lead to gold gnosis you won't find anywhere else on the internets. Regardless, I hope I have served humanity and you a fraction of how Hermes has served the meek, the misfit, and the mystic throughout history. Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is. It just is. Hello and goodbye, as always.